Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our virtual book launch of the book Scripting the Moves. And I am Carolyn Heinrich. I am the chair of the Department of Leadership, Policy, and Organizations, which is co-sponsoring this event with the Initiative for Race, Research, and Justice at the Peabody College of Vanderbilt University. I'm going to say just a couple logistical things and then come back in a minute to introduce our speakers. We'll have about a 30-minute conversation, which will be followed by Q&A. And we encourage you to please put your questions in the chat, but we will also take live questions at the end. Also, notification to everybody that this event is being recorded. And now I'm going to turn it over to Megan Levison. She is a sociology editor at Princeton University Press, who is also going to provide some information to you to get us started.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for being here. Joanne and I first started talking about this book back in 2015. And I am so proud to see it out in the world, getting the attention that it so richly deserves. I just want to mention, speaking of attention, the Washington Post reviewed it yesterday. And the reviewer noted that it was one of the deepest accounts of life in a demanding public charter school that I have ever read, which is such a, truer words couldn't be said about this book. So I'm delighted to have all of you here. I'm looking forward to this conversation. We're going to be raffling off 5 copies of the book at the end of the event, so stay tuned for that. And we also have a discount code, which is good for 30% off of the book at the PUP website. I'm going to put the code in the chat. It's just JGOL, and that will be good until the end of August.
Great, thank you so much. And now I'm going to turn to introduce our speakers this morning. First of all is Joanne Golann, and she is an assistant professor of public policy and education in our department, Leadership, Policy, and Organizations at the Peabody College at Vanderbilt University. She also holds a secondary appointment in the Department of Sociology, and she is an outstanding researcher and ethnographer. Her research has been published in the Sociology of Education, American Educational Research Journal, and American Behavioral Scientists, and has been featured in the New York Times, Education Week, Washington Post, again, as we just heard, The Atlantic, and The Guardian. And Jennifer Berkshire writes about education for the New Republic, The Baffler, the New York Times, and other publications. She is a creator and co-host of an education policy podcast, Have You Heard? And she teaches aspiring podcasters in the journalism program at Boston College and the labor studies program at UMass Amherst. She is the co-author with Jack Schneider of A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, Dismantling the Public Education Future of School. So I am really excited to turn it over to Jennifer and Joanne for our conversation on Scripting the Moves.
Well, I'm so excited to be here. I vividly remember when I first found Joanne's research. It was back in 2016, and I had been writing a lot about the sorts of schools where Joanne had been doing her research, but I was a blogger and a journalist. And so all I really had were anecdotes. And so I had the sense, as someone who's trained I have a PhD in English, someone who's trained to listen for contradictions in the stories we tell ourselves, I couldn't quite put together how these schools that were so popular and were the subject of so much media acclaim, how it was that they were accomplishing miracles as far as getting very high test scores and sending kids to college. And yet it seemed that the kinds of demands being made on the kids, I'm sorry, are you having trouble hearing me? Is that better? Okay. Better. The demands being made on the kids were very different from the way that we prepare more affluent students to go to college. So here I am, I find this research holding back to get ahead. And here Joanne has spent all this time not just researching a school, but she's actually been in there for more than a year. And so my level of excitement was really off the charts. So I reach out to Joanne, I ask her if I can interview her. And I believe the first sentence in that interview was that I wanted her to sum up the work she'd been doing for basically 2 years in a single sentence. So Joanne, so I just want you to talk a little bit about set the stage for us a little bit about how you ended up doing this in the first place. And in the meantime, while you talk, I will work on my audio.
It's much better now.
Okay.
Yeah, so don't worry about it.
Okay, great. Thanks.
And yes, well, first, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Carolyn and the department and the other sponsors. And to Jennifer. So Jennifer, as she mentioned, gave me my first interview when I was a graduate student. I can still remember nervously walking around and blabbing on. And I thought, but with your good editing skills, you made it into a really nice piece. And I thought the title of that piece was Holding Back to Get Ahead. And I thought that really succinctly captured what I was thinking about and what I was seeing. I was seeing these very strict schools trying to get students to college, get them ahead by asking them to kind of hold back and show self-constraint. So like you mentioned, what I did, I'm an ethnographer. So for those of you outside of the academic world, what that means is we spend a lot of time in often a single community or with a group of people, and we just observe what they're doing. We participate in the life, and the idea is to see people in their everyday life so we can understand their culture. So I found one of these schools. We call them no excuses schools. They're charter schools. It was a school that was a middle school. It served about 250 students in grades 5 to 8. About 80% of those students were low income, 2/3 Black, 1/3 Latino. And I just hung out with them for about a year and a half. So I was at that school 4 to 5 days a week, 4 to 5 hours a day. I was sitting in classrooms. I was sitting with those kids at lunch. I went with them on field trips. I sat in teacher meetings. So really immersing myself in that place to try to understand what they were doing, how they were doing it, and importantly, why they were doing it and what were the unintended consequences of their practices.
Well, I think you can imagine why I, as a writer, would be so excited to hear about the kind of research that Joanne was doing, and also just the idea that she had shown up at this school day after day and was basically walking down the hallway with kids. She's in the classes. So I'm going to be asking her, just as I would my podcasting students, to set a scene for us. But first, Joanne, we need some help with vocabulary. You're going to be walking us through a very specific form of school. They were called no excuses schools, or sometimes just high performing urban charter schools. So talk a little bit more about where they came from and why they so sort of seized on the education imagination at that moment.
Yeah, this term no excuses is used to describe this group of urban charter schools that emerged in the 1990s and 2000s. So KIPP was the first of these schools. KIPP now serves about 100,000 students in, I don't remember, 240 some odd schools. But after KIPP came a bunch of schools kind of copying this model, Achievement First, Uncommon Schools, Success Academy, Yes Pratt, Match, Mastery Republic. If you've heard of urban charter schools, it's probably a no excuses school. I mean, there are certainly other ones, but these really have come to dominate the urban charter school scene. And they attracted so much attention initially because they were getting results. Anyone who studies school reform, urban school reform, knows it's very, very challenging. And these schools were boosting students' test scores. They were getting kids to college. They were featured on everything you can imagine: Oprah, Newsweek. The U.S. Department of Education called KIPP one of the most promising initiatives in public education today. They received hundreds of millions of dollars. They continue to receive millions of dollars from large foundations like Walton, Gates, Broad. So yeah, they were getting people excited. And I think especially for those who support school choice and are school choice advocates, we know from the research, nationally, charter schools perform at about the same level as traditional public schools. But this particular brand of urban charter school was performing much better.
And what was so interesting about this particular moment was that there was all this media acclaim that Joanne is describing. I live in Massachusetts, and we have a set of high performing urban charter schools in Boston. And part of the reason I started writing about these issues was just the immense amount of media attention that they got. And yet when you actually looked, other than studies about the test scores, there were very few academics that had actually done any research into what it was like for the kids who attended the schools and the teachers who worked there. So Joanne she takes her notepad, she's an ethnographer. And Joanne, I want you to start by just describing what a typical day was like for you at Star Academy.
Yeah, so the day began at 7:30. So a lot of Nova Scotia schools extend the school day as well as the school year. Charter schools have more flexibility to do things like that. So the day started at 7:30. Like many charter schools, there was no transportation to the school, so no bus transportation. So parents would be dropping the kids off in the back of the school. If you were 1 minute late to school, you received a after-school detention. So pretty strict. Usually you'd have a teacher greeting you at the door, kind of checking, no hats, no hoodies on. Students would walk in and they were expected to be silent. So this was a small school. The hallways were really narrow, but there were tiles, it's a tiled floor, and students were supposed to walk on the second square tile they always said this, I'm trying to get it right, in straight, forward-facing, silent, straight, forward-facing lines on the single square tile. So hallways were silent, transitions into and out of classrooms were silent. Classrooms themselves were called different colleges. So you would kind of go into Princeton and they'd have Princeton's mascot and colors all painted on the wall. So it was certainly a college preparatory school combined with this strict discipline. There was a middle school, but there was no recess. There were no lockers. Even gym was pretty structured. So I kind of thought it was interesting. Gym started with silent reading even before they did the exercises.
And one of the first experiences that you come upon that you have to process is that students had to earn their seats. What was going on there?
Yeah, so this was the first time I realized kind of how strict this school really was. So it was new student orientation. So as I mentioned, these schools extend the school year. So they bring in students kind of mid-August, maybe about 2 weeks earlier than other schools to kind of learn what it's like to be in that school, learn the behavioral code. So after the first day of orientation, the teachers gathered together in a classroom to decide who was going to earn their first privilege, which was their seat. That day they had sat on the cafeteria floor. And so they asked the teachers, and the teachers kind of went around the room and would say, oh, Kyla, I don't think she should earn her seat. She was twirling around. Or Jameer, when we said lunch is over, he took, another bite of his sandwich. Or, Micah wasn't tracking the teacher. And listening to that, I thought, oh, wow, this is really specific. This is even during orientation, they have teachers kind of watching and taking notes on what students are doing. And over the course of the school year, I was given the behavioral data, and I found that the school, they actually recorded over 15,000 infractions for these students. So that averages to one infraction every 3 days per student for these very minor behaviors like tracking the speaker, not tracking the speaker, not following directions was one of the most common, putting a head down on a desk, having a side conversation.
Well, I can imagine that everybody wants to know, first of all, did you ever receive an infraction?
I must have got lucky.
So in the book, you describe this incredibly detailed system of reward and punishment. So I want you to sketch out for us some of the other components of it, but also the why behind it. How did this particular school and the administrators view the world that this made sense?
Yeah. So most of these schools use some kind of rewards and consequences system. A lot of them will use what's called a paycheck system. The school I was at kind of adapted that to a point system. So the idea is every week, you earn this fake paycheck, and depending on your behavior, you can get deductions from that paycheck, or maybe you can get, additional dollars. And at the end of the week, at some schools, if your paycheck falls under a certain amount, you'll get a detention or a suspension, or there's some other kind of, intervention. Conversely, you could qualify, for rewards. Like maybe you can use that money to buy something at the school store. At the school I was in, they had this point system was similar, and it qualified you for things like, can you attend a field trip? So there was like one student who was retained twice in the school. he went on one field trip in his 5 years at the school because he just never got his points, that high. There were other things like school socials you could earn. You could earn privileges like eating lunch with your friends, being exempt from whole group punishments. So these were all based on kind of your infractions. There was also detention, for behaviors. And the most controversial punishment in the school was called bench. This comes from the KIPP schools, a practice they call porch. I don't believe they do this anymore, but the school I was at, continue to do this. So if you're benched, it's like a form of in-school suspension, and you have to wear a yellow shirt, which the school had a collection of these. You can't talk to anyone but the teacher throughout the day. So if actually another student talks to you, they get put on bench as well. You're not allowed to participate in gym or any extracurricular activities. You eat lunch by yourself. So a pretty stigmatizing, kind of punishment. And in order to get off bench, students carried a clipboard where they had to, basically their teachers had to sign off that they followed directions through their class. And if they had two teachers who did not sign off for the day, or they had forgotten, this happened a lot, they'd forgotten to get the signature, the student would remain on bench for the next day.
One of the things that's so powerful about the book is that we really get a sense of what it's like to be a student at this particular school, and what it's like to be a student who's on the receiving end of this kind of constant monitoring. And some of the reaction that you portray is kind of counterintuitive. So I just want you to talk about, if you could maybe bring a story or two of those students to life about what it was like for them.
Yeah, it was really stressful to be in a school like this. And I think the counterintuitive part is that even students who were really well behaved actually felt that stress. I would have assumed it was students, and there were students like that. Like I remember sitting at a table with a group of girls who were like, I don't know, quote unquote, the bad kids, right? They were always getting into trouble. So they talked about, their hair falling out and having to go see a counselor. But even the very best students actually felt a tremendous amount of pressure, and maybe even more than the students who weren't complying, because they felt they had no room for error. There was no room to make a mistake, because teachers in these schools will kind of narrate behavior when they see it. They'll say, Michelle, great job tracking. So they felt they were, being put as a model. So one girl, I like to share this story because I think it's so, poignant. She was one of the best behaved girls, in the class. She was a girl her mom described as very independent, like someone who could run her household all by herself. She was a fifth grader. She, could cook breakfast, lunch, and dinner. She took care of her little brother. She washed and folded her laundry. And she had to stay home for 2 weeks because she was so overwhelmed by the pressure at the school that her parents just wouldn't send her in.
I want to ask you about teachers, but first, it really stuck out to me how aware the students were, and also other people at the school, that the kinds of discipline and the sort of the incessant quieting of the students was inculcating in them something that was very different from what it was that they were supposedly being prepared for. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. Did you hear from students that they knew that the college life was going to be different?
Yeah, I think there was a mix. So I think some students didn't know, right? They hadn't had, maybe parents who went to college or siblings. And so they got the wrong impression of college. They actually got the impression that college was really strict. And it was very similar to their school because that's what the teachers would use to justify the practices. They would say, these things are preparing you for college. So I remember having this first conversation with a kid during music class. And when I said, what do you think you'll need to be successful in college? And he said, self-control. And I said, oh, where did you get that idea from? Of course you need self-control, but, he had a really, warped perception of college. Another story I like to tell is this girl who visited a college, and she saw couches in the dormitory. And she said, oh, well, that must mean we can at least talk a little bit, because why are they going to have couches? Do they expect you to just sit down and read a book? So they might, they must let you talk a little bit, she has said. But then you have other students who are more perceptive, and I think, quite perceptive. And I highlight one of them, an 8th grader who had, stepsisters in college and questioned, you say you're preparing us for college, but you're not giving us, the words I use is tools, but she says it probably just as well, kind of the tools you need for college. Colleges aren't like this. And are we going to be able to transition, and have the independence to do these things once we're in college?
So you can hear how great this book is. So everyone should definitely take advantage of that discount code and order it. We're just taking our little mid-talk promotional break. You got to see a lot of the teaching close up. You were there in these classrooms week after week. So give us a sense of what it was like to be a teacher at Star Academy. You started off talking about the just astonishing number of infractions that were processed. And obviously the people doing most of that enforcing work are the people who are in the front lines, and those would be the educators at the school.
Yeah, I think one of the surprising things to me was this parallelism between teachers' experiences and students' experiences. They were actually both very scripted. And that's actually why I ended up calling the book Scripting the Moves, because I was trying to capture the scripts across the school. So I actually think the school itself is scripted, the teachers are scripted, the students are scripted. They did not have a lot of autonomy. So teachers were intentionally recruited because they were novice, because they were coachable. And there were very particular systems of behavioral management that they were required to follow, as well as teaching, what a lesson plan has to look like. I had a teacher who had many years of experience, had actually won a Teacher of the Year award in another urban charter school, who really struggled. She said she spent like 10 hours writing up lessons plans each week, which were sent to her supervisor, which were corrected because I had to be so specific. The teacher evaluation rubric, I have a little, sample in the book, and it takes up 4 pages, just the one little line. And there were lots more categories on there. So it was, I think, a trying experience for teachers as well. Now, teachers varied in their responses. Some appreciated it. They appreciated the support. They were novice. They felt, this was making them kind of feel like a professional, whereas other schools, it's kind of a sink or swim experience. But other teachers certainly felt micromanaged. And then what you mentioned about this idea of kind of becoming a disciplinarian, that's also, a teacher usually doesn't go into teaching to become a disciplinarian. And that became such a central part of many of their roles, especially teachers who did not have a good handle on their classrooms, which was difficult for them. And there was very high turnover in the school. So the previous year, 50% of their teachers have left.
And why do you think that was? I'm curious about the it's such a different kind of teaching than I think a lot of us are used to. And when I'm thinking about, for example, how important relationships are, and what it would be like for a young teacher to start at a very demanding school and realize that teaching is something very different than maybe what she or he thought. So did you have a chance to talk to a teacher who was leaving and get a sense of what the different pressures were that might have contributed to that?
Yeah, I think just like you said, I think that was a major reason. And Chris Torres has done some studies on teachers in no excuses schools and finds the main kind of predictors of teacher departure are the workload. They work crazy hours, 60 to 70 hours a week. And then their disagreement with disciplinary practices. So finding this wasn't the way they wanted to run a classroom. This wasn't what they thought, they had gone into teaching for, and not finding the autonomy to be able to modify practices. Although in the book, I show that some do in little ways modify practices, but on the large scale, difficult to do that. And it was difficult to build relationships with students as well. I think there was one teacher who, again, had, many years of experience in a previous school. And he said, it's never been as hard for him to build relationships with students as it was in this school, because they saw him as someone who was out to get them, someone who was picking on them all the time and giving them consequences all the time. And he said it was not until our ice skating like field trip that I started to like build relationships with students. And I guess the other component that I also talk about in the book is this idea of like the highly structured time. So the schools do this to do what they call maximize instructional time. So like, that's why we have silent transitions into the classroom, not because we want to be controlling, but because we want to save time, right? You know, how much time do we waste when kids are kind of talking on their way into the classroom or talking in the hallway? They want to continue that conversation or they're going to get into a fight. So it was for instruction. But what happens is those are actually the times where you can like get to know a teacher, you know, a little bit more informally. Like I can think back to high school. My locker was like right next to my history teacher's room. And I feel like half our conversations were there in the hallway, right? With my locker in his classroom. So these little interactions, you don't think about them, but you're losing them when you have so much structure in your school day.
Well, somebody just commented in the chat, I cannot wait to read this book. I used to work in a no excuses charter school. And part of what makes the book so compelling is that Joanne, she really documents for us the sort of day by day rhythms of a school like this and its approach to things like classroom management and discipline. But she also is able to back up and give us an understanding of where they break down and sort of what the bigger picture contradictions are. And one thing that I found so interesting was that, Joanne, you picked up on the fact that administrators at the school were often aware that all of these policies were not necessarily leading to the stated goals of the school. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think, you know, when I talked to administrators, the model was first adopted because, you know, this principal was at a school that it was just chaotic and he could not establish order. He just said he was putting out fires all the time. And he thought, you know, what am I going to do, basically? And then he said, oh, I remember a school that worked. Let's go visit them and see what they're doing. And we're just going to copy everything they're doing. So it ended up being, you know, they visited a KIPP school and a common school, these no excuses schools. And he literally told them, whatever they're doing, we're going to do it. And these schools are very willing to like share their practices, their rubrics. So they copied those practices and the school transformed. I mean, according to him, you know, we saw order, we saw increases in test scores. But the problem is you've got this script, you've got this thing that you think works for some of your most immediate goals, but then it becomes like very hard to modify it. So I asked the administrator, like, what are some of your like, you know, what policies could you get rid of? I kind of thought like there must be some of these, like there's so many little policies, you know, that you don't need. And he kind of thought like, I don't know, you know, we probably need 99 out of 100 of them to make this model work. So kind of you had adopted this as a package deal and you kind of don't know what's making it work and you're reluctant to modify it for fear of the counterfactual, of kind of losing order. So I think administrators realize, especially, you know, administrators of color, like they had other goals for their students and for their school. You know, one of the school leaders, a Black woman whom I admire a lot, talked a lot about her goal was to help students develop their voices, to develop critical consciousness, to make a difference in their own communities. And I would ask her kind of, well, you know, the students are not feeling like they have much of a voice. And, you know, she acknowledged that, but I don't think felt there was room to make changes without losing, you know, what they had established already. So they did find themselves, I think, in a bind. And I think schools are finding themselves in that bind as they're seeking to make changes to their practices. It's hard you can't just tinker along the edges. It's such a part of the model. And you almost have to make pretty significant changes to really make something else that's effective.
So you're obviously a sociologist, and this book fits squarely within a tradition of sociologists looking at schools and how they reproduce the social order. And this was another thing that so thrilled me about the research that would become this book. that there's a famous work of sociology that looked at how particular kinds of schools actually steered working class students into particular occupations by basically grooming them to be rule followers. Meanwhile, at more affluent schools, students were sitting around Harkness tables and being encouraged to pursue the spirit of inquiry. So, Joanne, give us a very quick sociology lecture about how this book updates some key research from the annals.
That's a good way to put it. I was kind of turning my head. I'm like, is it there on the shelf? It probably is. But yeah, Bowles and Gintis were the first. These were sort of neo-Marxists, and they were looking at schools as reproducing the capitalist structure. That's what they were sort of seeing. And they were seeing, just as you said, in working class schools, students are taught procedure, they're taught compliance, they're taught deference. And the idea here is these are the kinds of schools who are going to these are the kinds of students who are going to get working class jobs where you need to clock in on time, where you can't, push back against your advisor. So they're preparing them to take those positions. Similarly, for middle class students, we're giving them much more freedom, flexibility, decision-making power to prepare them to be managers, to be leaders. So I found these same dynamics, but the twist is in this school, kind of like your column, it's holding back to get ahead. So they're actually trying to prepare these students for college and for upward mobility, yet they're using kind of very similar techniques that we find in working class schools. So that was kind of the update to Bowles and Gintis, but we find the same thing. Jean Annion's work shows that. Kathleen Wilcox. I mean, there've been a number of sociologists who've kind of shown these trends empirically. And you can just look at schools. My brother is moving to Arlington, Virginia, and he sent me the name of the public elementary school in his district. And I went to the website, and it's all about, personalized learning, design thinking, problem solving. These are the kinds of schools that middle class, affluent communities are encouraging.
I, of course, have many more questions for you, but we're starting to get some excellent questions in the chat. So what I'm going to do is combine some of them because we have some from some researchers. Shout out to Chris Torres and Susan DeJarnett in Philadelphia. So we often hear now that these sorts of schools they're not run this way anymore. No excuses has actually been kind of dropped from the education parlance. You certainly don't hear anything about broken windows schooling. So I want you to talk about the popular influence that your work has ended up having to the extent that the needle has been moved. But I also want you to respond to a question from Chris and Susan about what you say when you hear that, well, schools don't really do that anymore.
Yeah, those are great questions. And yes, I think the impact actually started with your interview. I mean, that's what got my work first into the media, and then it was picked up. It was just when these schools were starting to question their disciplinary practices, or not the schools yet, but other people were starting to kind of question the disciplinary practices. So the work got picked up in that way. There was one network in New York City, Ascend, that actually cited my work, my first article, as a reason for why they were shifting their disciplinary policy. So that's been, very encouraging for academics to live in their little, bubble to see some impacts out in the world. And a lot of schools in the past years have been talking about changing practices, and some have been changing practices. But I would say certainly push back a little bit. I think to what I was saying before, that I think change is hard. A lot of studies, not even of charter schools, but just of schools that are trying to adopt restorative justice or more progressive disciplinary approaches, find that they're not very faithful in adopting these approaches. They kind of just take a little piece, we'll do a restorative circle here, but in other ways, they still have very punitive practices, or they're still using rewards and consequences. So I think it's easy to kind of add a little here, but not really make, deep change. And I think these school networks themselves are seeing this. So just this year, we have large networks like KIPP, like Noble, apologizing apologizing to their own alumni for their disciplinary practices and making commitments to change. So people who are saying these things don't exist anymore, well, I would say, look at the networks themselves. They're admitting that they exist and admitting that they need, that there's a lot of work they need to do to shift their practices.
We've got a Nashville teacher watching. Hi, Ellen. And Ellen wants to know, like, she's, nodding along with your critique, but she wants to know, well, then what should teachers be doing? And I thought this might be a good opportunity for you to talk about, we've focused almost exclusively on the classroom management and discipline aspect in the schools, but as you point out in the book, that's not all. There are certain instructional practices. And I'm wondering if maybe you can talk a little bit about things that these schools have done that might be worth implementing in another context.
Yeah, that's a good point. There are things that are worth thinking about and learning from these schools. I thought the teacher coaching was actually very beneficial. Now, not necessarily, they were often coaching around discipline. The principal there said, 90% of our coaching is around, I forget how you put it, but around behavior, not around content. But I think you could use this kind of coaching to build, teachers' ability to manage classrooms in different ways, or to build instructional, skills. So they would have a teacher. They would assign each teacher a kind of a teacher coach who would come in and observe their classroom every week. Sometimes they would videotape that classroom, and they would every week would have a feedback session where they would meet. They would look at that video. They would give what they call kind of key levers, so like a key point that you can work on for the next week, and then they would observe again and see how did they do on that key lever. So I think that kind of support for teachers, I think, can be very productive. So that's one thing I think that could be taken from the model.
We've got another question. Can you speak to the role that race plays in these contexts? And it's important to note that you mentioned the Noble charter school chain in Chicago, basically taking a step back from no excuses practices, and administrators specifically cited race in what was basically an apology letter to alumni. So talk about how this rethinking of no excuses fits into the larger moment of racial reckoning that we're going through, and also how you talk about race as a complicating issue in the book.
Yeah, I think, you can't talk about school discipline and of students of color without talking about race. And I think this past year, we as a society are seeing the ways in which social control is racialized, and the deep problematic of that. So who we think is threatening, what amount of control we think is tolerable. I mean, these are all shaped by race. There's a plethora of literature on school discipline that shows Black students, especially Black male students, are more likely to be disciplined, more harshly disciplined, more disciplined for subjective behaviors than white students or Asian students. And of course, there's a big literature on this school to prison pipeline that's very related to issues of school discipline. So I actually think that is why many of these networks in this past year are, they may have talked about making change before, but are really taking a stand because of what's been going on in society. And I think these schools themselves, when I was at this school, and there have been other people who've written articles on this, that these schools tend to take a colorblind approach. I did not hear talk about race, maybe once during orientation, and then that was, a couple little things here and there, but it was not a race, the school was not race conscious. And I think that's really important for schools where you are serving almost all students of color, and your teaching staff is almost all white. Like, race and racism needs to be part of teacher training. It needs to be part of the curriculum. It needs to be part of discussions over discipline. So being more race conscious is really important in these schools moving forward.
Another great question. This one comes from Michael. He wants to know what you think about schools that are moving away from the disciplinary practices that you've been helping us understand, but are holding on to the curricular practices. So basically, they're still using Teach Like a Champion, but maybe they've switched to a praise-only narration model. So he wants to know, what you think about these. And then as I read his question, I'm thinking about those administrators at Star Academy and how much they worried that if they let up, that the school would revert to chaos.
Mhm. Yeah, well, that's a whole nother bucket I didn't attack, which is instruction. If I were to go back, I would maybe, that'd be another book. But I think that's certainly another discussion. I mean, it's a very structured, at least in the school I was at, instruction, and I've read a little bit about it. It was like, I don't know, the do now, I forget, the lesson, independent practice, guided practice, the exit ticket. It wasn't what you would think of as, project-based learning or a more progressive approach to teaching and learning. John Mehta and Sarah Fine have this book, In Search of Deeper Learning, where they go around to all different kinds of high schools, and they're trying to figure out where is deeper learning happening. And actually, one chapter is on a no excuses school. So they find that these rigid structures do inhibit, deeper learning, but they do find, compared to some other schools, that we are seeing some, learning happening in these schools. So I think that's a bigger question, probably something I couldn't answer. You have to give it to my colleagues in teaching and learning, but I think it's a good one, right? There's certainly room to think about those practices. And I think to this question of like, would things fall apart? Well, they may fall apart with the teaching staff you have. So these schools are recruiting novice teachers who don't have experience, necessarily, who don't have experience teaching and managing classrooms. So it is more difficult to manage a classroom in a more flexible way. So shifting suddenly to that kind of system without having the staff who knows how to do that is going to be a challenge. So I think these schools, right, also have to think about how to recruit experienced teachers, how to retain teachers, and issues like that.
You mentioned extracurricular activities, and we've got a question about that. He wants to know more about what that aspect of the school was like, the non-curricular aspect, and what you saw as far as the non-curricular preparation that these schools might have been doing to get kids ready for college, the counseling, you mentioned a college visit. So help us understand that.
Yeah, so they had these after-school clubs. When I started visiting the schools kind of on a Friday, they kind of did a half-day Friday where they had sort of extracurricular clubs, but they eventually got rid of that and used that for teacher prep because the teachers were so exhausted. So in terms of like extracurricular activities, they didn't have sports because they just didn't have like facilities, for that. There was orchestra. They had ballroom dancing, which was not the most popular option among students. A few things, not too much, because they had after school tutoring, which a lot of these schools have. So that was kind of the major after school activity. In terms of college prep, I was at the high school for, about a semester. They did have like a college advisory class that was, quite structured in terms, and a lot of these schools have these, right, in terms of college visits, in terms of making sure students are applying to colleges that are within their kind of SAT range, within their price range. So they had things like that. I actually recently reviewed a paper that will be coming out soon about the kind of college practices of no excuses schools. And what she found is that in some ways they were a little bit too narrow, too scripted, I would say. So it didn't fit the needs of all students. So they said, look for state schools within a certain, they encouraged them to go to state schools because they were more affordable. But maybe a student would have done better at an HBC, a historically Black university, but they didn't direct them that way. So there were some issues with the scripted nature of sort of the college prep as well.
So you got a very nice comment from Claire in the chat, praising your skills as an ethnographer. So shout out to you for that. And then Lauren would like to know some more about that. She wants you to put your ethnographer's hat on and talk about how you managed your relationship with the school, given that you were both there, quote unquote, being a student, but that you were also an observer. So how did you pull it off?
Yeah, very awkward. Sometimes I think like these are things you can only do as a graduate student. But it's exhausting to be an ethnographer anywhere. It's just exhausting to be there all the time because you're there so much and yet you feel like you're missing so much because you're not there half the time. And then you have to go home and write all these field notes, which takes just as long, if not longer, often longer than the time you're in the field. I think I don't know if I mentioned Jessica Clarko, but she's a school ethnographer, and she said she would drink like a 2-liter Mountain Dew or something every day of her field work to just keep going. So it's hard work, and it's awkward because you don't necessarily have a role. So when I talk to other people, I recommend, can you find a role in the place you're studying? Because it's awkward to just be someone watching people, kind of all the time. You feel a little awkward about that. The role I took on, was I wanted to kind of align myself with the students, but also get the teacher's perspective. So I sort of took a middle role there. I kind of told the school I wasn't going to discipline students at all because I didn't want to be seen as a disciplinarian, with an authority figure. And they were okay with that. And it was funny, the students really noticed that. So I remember like telling a student, like in the hallway, like occasionally, like, reprimanding them for something, like don't talk in the hallway or something. And the students said, oh, like you've changed sides. So they like really, they caught on that like I was not on the teacher's side then. But at the same time, right, I wanted the teacher's perspective. I had a closer back down to the teachers. So it was kind of this balance, I think, between trying to get a well-rounded view of the school.
So the questions are coming in fast. They're all great. So we're going to try to get to more of them, and I'll combine some of them when I can. But Rafi has a good one. He wants to know what you saw as far as how parents and other caregivers related to the school. And I thought this might be a nice opportunity for you to mention the other research that you've been doing with Mira Debs about comparing no excuses schools and Montessori schools.
Yeah, we have a paper comparing parent perspectives of these two schools. We talk a lot in the school choice literature about parents choosing these schools, but actually I found that parents know very little about these schools when they choose them. They're just looking for a good option, a different option to what they have, a safe option. They don't know about the practices really. I found they didn't know almost at all anything about this school. It's only until after they're in the school that they start learning about, what it's like. So that paper really looks at what we call like post-satisfaction fit. So, people will say, well, these parents are choosing these schools. So what's wrong with that? Why not give them that option? Well, actually, a lot of parents weren't satisfied with the disciplinary practices in the school. They were satisfied with the school because their students were doing well, because it was safe, but they were not happy with getting called all the time for, because my daughter was humming during a fire drill or laughing. They did not like the kind of micromanaging of the school's practices by and large.
Sophie's got a very interesting question. So obviously this was a school that was hyper-focused on preparing kids for college, but did you witness students sort of forming goals as far as what careers they were interested in that might have related to this very strict context?
I didn't get as much of a sense about that. I mean, I think what you hear, like I'm trying to remember, like when they had final projects about like, what are you going to do in 10 years? It's kind of what you would expect or not, going to be a doctor, going to be a basketball player, going to be a forensic scientist. So not necessarily, a concrete, plan or relationship between the school's practices and what they were thinking about going forward. I feel like these schools emphasize college much more than they do careers.
So we had a couple of questions about what's going to happen next. You ended up writing this book in part because these schools got so much attention because of their ability to deliver high test scores. So question number one. Now that schools have been backing away from the no excuses model, what's happening as far as their continued ability to deliver high test scores? And the second part of the question is about the incentives that are currently in place, right? That there was all sorts of emphasis on bringing these models to scale because they delivered results. And somebody wants to know whether, are there other incentives that might help schools treat students in a more humane way?
Yeah, I've already forgot the first part. Remind me the
First part is just like, what's happening now that schools are backing away from these disciplinary projects? Are you seeing this show up in their data?
Yeah, I haven't seen any research that is looking right at schools that are changing practices and what's the impact on test scores. But there are much like the KIPP Bay Area schools, they started experimenting with sort of just, I want to say a decade ago, and really didn't see any impact on their test scores. People who study restorative justice often find a little dip like the first year, or two, maybe not in test scores, but in discipline in the school. And then it kind of, people kind of figure out the system. So what research does show is that we actually don't know that discipline is driving the impacts on test scores at these schools. So economists don't always kind of open up the black box, but a few have tried to. And one study, they find that it is tutoring, after school tutoring in these schools that's driving the test score impacts. Another study finds 5 things. Among these are the teacher coaching, tutoring, high expectations, a mix of different things. So it's not clear, right, that actually the discipline is the main, I think an administrator in the school would say, yes, this is driving our test scores, and I don't want to discount that, but I would say the research doesn't necessarily show that to be the case. In terms of other incentives, yeah, I think it's good to see a little bit of a shift from NCLB to ESSA, right, with thinking about other metrics for success beyond test scores. So we're seeing a little bit more flexibility in states in being able to set other metrics. Things like looking at discipline or suspension rates, are one way to try to address that issue. But I think it's hard because a lot of these things aren't measurable, or policymakers don't want to put they're not going to put them, things like a student-teacher relationship. How do you, how are you going to measure that? Or a student feeling comfortable and, in a school environment. I think it's tricky to think about. I like the idea of thinking about incentives. I will think a little bit more about it. But I think it's tricky to think how, a state policy or something like that might incentivize these schools in the right direction. I could see around discipline. Another place to think about is charter authorizers. So trying to give them some incentives for when they're reviewing charter applications, what to look for, could be another place.
Well, our next question happens to be about data. What does the research tell us about how students who graduate from these kinds of schools actually do fare in college?
Yeah, so because these schools are pretty young, we don't have a lot of data, but we do actually have some suggestive data. So there are 2 studies that find that these schools are actually doing no better in terms of student persistence than comparable traditional public schools. So they are doing better in terms of getting students to college, but no better in getting students through college, which is obviously the goal, right? The KIPP network itself has been tracking their students, and they're finding that about 1/3 of their students graduate from college within 6 years, which is, of course, much lower than what they would hope.
And your book is obviously going to get a tremendous amount of attention, including from people who run and or work at these schools. What kind of advice do you have for them as they grapple with this moment of change, the fact that this approach is falling out of favor? What would you tell them to do?
Yeah, I think read the book now. Just kidding. I think some of the things I said, working on recruiting and retaining experienced teachers, being more race conscious in their practices. I think encouraging student voice, parent and community feedback, thinking for themselves how they define success. So I think that was what was kind of enlightening for the principal at my school. I was listening on a conversation he had with another school leader, and they were talking about, how do you define success? And for him, he said he had never really thought about it. He had thought, it was always test scores, and that was what fulfilled me. And he's like, well, now, I've been doing this a couple of years. That doesn't really fulfill me anymore. So kind of thinking about, what do you really want to accomplish, in your school? What do you want your students to leave with? Educators know that, right? And does that match the practices that you have? Does that match what students are saying to you, what teachers are saying to you?
Well, I'm very curious to hear what you have planned to work on next. Is there another ethnography in your future?
I hope so, post-pandemic. Right now I'm doing a video ethnography, which I can do in the confines of my office, which is looking at something quite different. It's looking at parenting practices among families with young children. So kind of also thinking about how they're developing these social and behavioral skills across social class. But that's the current project.
And also, I'm curious, there were a couple times in this where you said, there was something that had come up where it was something that you either didn't have the bandwidth to address directly in your work, or, it wasn't quite your focus. Where do you think the research should go next?
Good question. On No Excuses Schools, or just on in general?
Both on No Excuses Schools. I mean, it feels like the conversation is starting to shift. So I'm asking both where you'd like to see the conversation go, but also, where you think there are holes in the research that would enable us to craft better policies.
Yeah, big question. A project I was tempted to do was actually looking at these schools that are that have made these public apologies and are trying to shift their practices. Noble would be a good example to study Noble. So if anyone out there, if there are any researchers out there, they seem to be making a really concerted effort to engage in race-conscious practices, and they're the largest charter network in Chicago. So I would love to see, what does that look like? What are they trying to do? How is it working? I think those lessons, could be then transferred to other kinds of No Excuses schools. In a bigger policy realm, there's questions like you address, and thinking about where does school choice fit in the system. We're seeing that expand. Market-based, education reforms are just, they keep expanding. We're seeing all sorts of them all across the country, different forms. Thinking as you think about, so this is a plug for Jennifer's book. It's really thinking about threats to public education and the future of public education. And I think those are really important questions that need to be considered.
Well, believe it or not, we've reached the end of our hour, and we will receive an infraction if we go over. So we better wrap up. I want to congratulate Joanne for the publication of an amazing book. I can't say enough about how vivid it is and how important. So I hope that people will order it. And thanks so much to everyone who asked a question. They were really great.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. You were a terrific moderator, as I knew you would be. And I just wanted to quickly say thanks. I didn't get to say thanks earlier to some people, Kurt Brobeck, Evan Curran, Brian Smokler. They've been helping to kind of spread the word at Peabody and work on the tech here. And Megan is going to do the little, I don't know if it's in the chat already, I haven't seen, but she's going to give away some books. So don't forget to take a look out for that.
Yes, I just notified all of our raffle winners. So 5 lucky people will be getting their books next week.
And don't forget, you can get a 30% off discount, JGOL from Princeton University Press, if you want a copy of the book. So thank you, everybody, for joining. I know I have old friends in here, as well as colleagues and people I don't know. So I really appreciate you all being with us today.